This watch is not cheap and it has the latest and greatest from Polar, or it's supposed to, but there are some seriously strange choices in making of this watch that put me on the edge of not wanting to wear it. So watch the video and you'll find out why. So the total weight of only 59 grams puts the Vantage V3 amongst lightweight watches. The display size is just under 1.4 inches, which is great, but I still think the bezel is unnecessarily large. But there are some good things about this watch that make up for that slightly larger bezel. For example, the case of the watch is made of aluminum and the bezel around it is of aerospace aluminum. This specific kind of aluminum is very high strength, corrosion resistant, and it has other characteristics that make them suitable for making aircrafts, etc. Both types of aluminum that are used in the making of this watch are still relatively affordable compared to titanium, and they're very lightweight. Good choice, Polar. But the case back itself looks plastic to me, and there's no mention of this in the spec sheet. And since they instead say the case is made of aluminum, I find it deceiving because many people would probably think that the entire case, including the back, is aluminum, not just the housing, which is the way it is now. And the display has Gorilla Glass 3, which is pretty standard, and they don't have a sapphire version. I find the design really modern and attractive. Unlike most other fitness smartwatches these days, we have a touch screen on this watch plus 5 physical buttons. And I have something to say about this in a minute. But the materials look and feel high quality and yet lightweight and comfortable to wear. The display is also very bright, which makes it easy to read outdoors in direct sunshine, especially since by default the display brightness is set to high in the settings. And the fact that the font size is quite big, making all the prompts quite legible. And same goes for the straps in terms of quality and comfort. The buttons though aren't very clicky. They feel very different to what I'm used to. They have quite a bit of resistance when you press them down, and of course with a small feedback at the end of pressing, but I'm not a big fan of how it feels when using them. With this watch you get 32 gigabytes of storage and 37 megabytes of RAM. Now if you compare that to some watches that run on Wear OS that come with something like 2 gigabytes of RAM, it sounds laughable, but since this watch is running on its own operating system, it simply doesn't need that much RAM, and it obviously doesn't have some of the capabilities of more graphic-centric smartwatches anyway. But to give you a little perspective, the Vantage V2's RAM was 0.64 megabytes, so that's quite a huge jump. But how is it in real life? Does it ever lag? So far I haven't noticed any lags in most parts of the UI, and if there is any lags, it's naturally during navigation on maps. This watch was designed in Finland and they operate in very cold temperatures, down to minus 20 degrees Celsius or minus 4 degrees Fahrenheit. So you want to wear it in very cold climates? No problem. One of the weird things I didn't expect from this watch is that it doesn't have ANT+, and the Bluetooth version is only 5.1, not the current latest of 5.3. But it does have a new optical heart rate monitoring sensor, an ECG sensor, a blood oxygen sensor, plus a skin temperature sensor. The ECG feature effectively only measures your HRV or heart rate variability, so it won't detect or prompt you for any irregularities or AFib detection. So I don't even know why they're calling it an ECG. They might as well just call it an on-demand HRV test. And when it comes to blood oxygen or SpO2 sensor, nowadays when I hear that a watch has this sensor, I immediately assume that it must have both 24-hour and overnight tracking capabilities. But again, to my surprise, this watch doesn't do any of those, and instead you just have to do an on-demand test. But I wish at least that worked properly. You see, I've been trying to run some tests alongside the blood oxygen saturation test, and unfortunately, it fails the test quite often. Sometimes even a repeat test fails even though I'm wearing the watch snug and I have no movement. The skin temperature sensor though, like many other watches these days, requires you to wear the watch at night for 3 nights to calculate a baseline. After that, it only shows you the deviations from that baseline during sleep, and that's it. So if this is going to be your first smartwatch, don't confuse this with core temperature. A favorite of mine on this watch is the nightly recharge feature. So the watch is obviously capable of sleep tracking, including all the sleep stages, but it actually includes a couple other things here. So the nightly recharge includes a score for how well you sleep called sleep charge, and another one called ANS charge. ANS refers to autonomic nervous system, and it measures how well your body handles stress during the first 4 hours of sleep. It's a favorite feature of mine because I can quickly decide whether I can push myself today or just rest and relax. And in the sleep charge view, you can actually rate how you slept yourself, but I doubt that it'll affect their scoring algorithm and calculations. Please like the video if you're finding this helpful. I've reviewed a lot of watches here, and I don't think I remember any brands other than Polar and their watches that track so many exercises and activities. I mean, you'd be surprised to learn about the list of the things you can track with this watch. To be exact, that's more than 150 sport profiles. And by the way, it's up to 50 meters water resistant if you're interested in tracking your swims. But the thing is, you can only have a list of up to 20 activities to track on the watch, and you can only update the list of sports and activities from the app, not the watch itself. I personally tried walking, running, and strength training with this watch, and I have a lot to say and I don't know where to start. So let's start with the good parts. Regardless of what activity I do, I love diving deep into my stats right after my activities. And I love it that the Vantage V3 shows me not just the total of calories burned or even a total of my metabolic or energy sources used during the activity, but also allows you to find the trend of burning of energy during time on the app. If I had to pick my absolute favorite feature, it would be this one. And that's because with this feature, you would know how to modify your exercise. Like if you need to burn fat, you can learn from the past activities and how the change in the intensity of the activity affects the energy sources by seconds and minutes. The other good thing I've used every time I ran with this watch, especially during very cold weather, that you just want to tuck your watch under the sleeve, is the voice guidance, which tells you of important stats like distance, pace, and average heart rate. But to kind of turn this story around, on the other hand, the voice guidance requires an active Polar Flow mobile app connection. Also, when you look at the past activity on the watch, the heart rate zones unfortunately don't show the exact heart rates. Instead, it's just 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and the time spent in each zone. The only way to know your exact zones is by looking at your stats in the app. So again, I find this unnecessary because not everyone knows their heart rate zones by heart, and it's a bad assumption to think otherwise. And I want to talk more about this in a bit. I find the accuracy of the GPS good, and I don't usually care about details, but for example, when I was running in an underpass of less than 20 meters with gaps in between, the GPS connection was lost, but then immediately was back on. How do I know that? Well, thanks to the voice guidance, I can hear that immediately when gaining or losing connection. Then there's the matter of the accuracy of the heart rate, which is perhaps the most important when it comes to a watch like this. Overall, I must say there's something wrong here. Not just during exercise or high intensity moments, but even at rest, the HR can be a little off. For me, usually higher than it's supposed to be, and that's by as much as 15 to 20 BPM, which is a lot. During physical activities, I also realized there's a certain amount of time, especially during the beginning of the workout, that the heart rate can be as inaccurate as it can get. But I was really interested in knowing the performance of the sensor at higher BPMs. So while wearing a very accurate heart rate chest strap, at the end of a long training session, I ran for 10 seconds of all-out effort. So my special 10-second test is too short to raise my heart rate to max, but it's long enough to raise it significantly. And I wanted to understand how quick the sensor reacts. And just like I suspected, it didn't react fast enough. As I just told you, during the beginning of the exercise, I felt like there's this timely gap before the heart rate stabilizes and becomes more reliable. Same thing happened in my 10-second test, where I was able to raise my actual heart rate to 170 BPM, while the Vantage V3 only went up to 164. And by the way, it was super hard to do this in the middle of a snowstorm, so please subscribe so I'd know it was worth it. So again, my assumption was that a longer test would make things look more accurate, and while overall you can rely on the HR in the sense that it's a good estimate of what your actual heart rate is, unfortunately it's not a spot-on accuracy, especially during high heart rates. For example, the second day I wore a few $1,000, I believe 7-lead ECG device, and it recorded a maximum heart rate of 190 BPM, while the Vantage V3 only registered 185. And this time the activity was longer and the watch definitely had enough time to stabilize or whatever, and it didn't happen. Now that we're talking about the accuracy of the sensors, let us bring in another topic, which is about a special feature of this watch. So the Polar Vantage V3 has some specialized tests that you could do. For example, the SpO2 and ECG test that I already talked about, plus some more like fitness test, walk and running test, etc. But for example, I've attempted to do the orthostatic test and I've only been able to do it once successfully. And just like that failing SpO2 test that I mentioned before, it's really discouraging at best to see all these tests fail on your brand new watch. As another example, the fitness test failed many times, and to add insult to injury, say you want to do the orthostatic test with a chest strap for more accuracy, it would only work if you had a Polar chest strap, which is super annoying that you can use other brands' HR chest straps with this watch. And some of these tests, like the fitness test, the walking test, and the running test, provide an estimated VO2 max. But here's the thing, the walking, the running, and the fitness test each have given me a widely different number. I personally consider the VO2 max that's derived from the fitness test unreliable, the walking test more reliable, and the running test the most reliable. And for the walking test, I wasn't able to do it on a flat terrain and with a steady pace as it instructed me, so that might have affected the result. But for the running test, I did every step right, and I still got a terrible VO2 max, which I know isn't right. Now, going back to the accuracy of the sensors, I really doubt that the hardware is inferior to any other brands, especially when it comes to this brand, because Polar makes some of the most accurate heart rate monitors. So I doubt that there is something wrong with the hardware itself, but rather it's a software optimization that needs to be worked on. You know, user experience is really important, and if there are so many bugs or their software just can't handle the amount of noise that exists in the wrist area, then how can you rely on it no matter how many latest generation sensors they've put in the watch? Make sense? And I repeat that the user experience comes first, and it's not great on this watch. Like, it can be confusing. For example, when I started an activity, I was really confused how to stop the activity. There's a button on the screen that does nothing in terms of stopping the activity. The swiping actions or other taps don't do anything. And there are 5 more physical buttons to try when you're not familiar with the watch. And it was, by the way, the bottom left button that I needed to press and hold for a while to stop the tracking. You see, that should be prompted to the user, and they shouldn't assume that everyone knows how to use a Polar watch. Assumptions with no data to back up can be a hit or miss in user experience. Of course, there is a learning curve, and I'm coming from Garmin and I'm not used to it, but even as a beginner, I expect there to be more of a smooth and flatter learning curve as opposed to the current steep learning curve. Here's another example. This is a touchscreen watch, but when you're navigating in the menus, if you want to go back, you'd have to press the back button, which is totally unnecessary. They should have just made the swipe back or swipe right feature in addition to being able to use the back button. With this watch, unfortunately, the touchscreen capability is only a complement, not a standalone feature, which means you're going to have to use the buttons for a lot of things. There are a few more things about this watch that I'll talk about in the next video, so subscribe and stay tuned. But in the meantime, if you like Polar watches, you might as well watch this video next.